or a concrete setout plan in ArchiCAD. The purpose of the concrete setout plan is to explain the levels of all of the different concrete elements. So in this case, we're talking about slab. This particular plan here that we're looking at is a basement, and so we're looking at the slab of the basement, the turning plate for vehicles. We can see that there's a recessed section of the slab. Now we could call this the footing. In ArchiCAD, the way that I'm doing this at the moment is to do this as a slab as well, which makes it easier to label. We have a spoon drain on the outside, which is a footing. Sorry, like a beam, sorry. We've got the driveway, which is made of roofs. We've got columns and walls. So there's a lot of different 3D elements. I'm also showing things differently. And so you can see that the doors are shown very simply, and there's no finishes on any of the walls. And so we can do this all within the setting of ArchiCAD. And I'm going to show you two levels. I'll show you this one at the moment because this one's complete, and then we'll go up a level and we'll start adding to it just so I can explain to you how to create it. All right, first, there's all these different settings which allow us to adjust the way that things work or the way that things look in ArchiCAD. So when we go into our view settings, we have layer combination, we have structural display. So in this case, you see it's changed from entire model to core only. In the model view, I've created a model view type called set down. There's a graphic override that I've created called slab setout. And in this case, it's a complete new build, so renovation filter has no significance or usefulness, and so that's just changed to show all elements, which effectively just means renovation filter, go away, don't show me anything, or don't do anything. So that's different things that are overriding the way this works. How do these work? How do the floor levels work? The levels, the dimensions, the floor height dimensions, so in this case SFL stands for structural floor level. In order to create this, we're using a label tool, and we can't copy paste this, it needs to be redone. So I just picked up the settings on that floor, and now to add it to this floor, I just find where I want to place it. This is sort of the entry over here, so I'll make sure that my slab turns blue first, which means it's selected, and then I'll click to place it. Now, just to explain how this works, if we go into the settings, we can see that it's at 0 to this story, which is good. We see it's also a thick slab, 300 millimeters. And so the 25730 comes from the story settings. So when we go into the story settings, we can see that that's based on the elevation of this story. Now, if we go into more detail of the element itself, or the tool itself, we're using the elevation label. And then under symbol label custom settings, it's based on the project origin, not the current story. It's the elevation of the core, not the entire element, which means we need to be using a composite to make this work really well. At the moment, I'm just drawing simple slabs, so it doesn't need to be, but I will eventually change these to a composite slab, and therefore it's still going to reference to the core as it should be. And we can add here a parameter name. So I'm choosing to type in SFL. Of course, I could be writing FFL, finished floor level. And if I did that, I'd want to change this to top of entire element. The really nice thing about the label tool is I can also do the bottom of. So I can use this tool to do reflected ceiling plans as well. And if I do the bottom elevation of, I can change that to entire element or core as well. So I really like the label tool more than the elevation or the level dimension tool because it just gives us more settings. However, we can't always use the label tool. Sometimes we need to use the level dimension tool. A good example of that is when we're talking about roofs. So in this case, because this is a driveway and we need a transition ramp, I'm using the label tool to describe the slabs, but then I need to use this tool, which is this tool, level dimension tool, in order to describe the points of the roof. The problem is that this tool doesn't give me as many options. It doesn't give me the ability to do core or top surface, and it doesn't give me the ability to do the bottom. It's only going to ever do the top of. And so it's not quite as useful, not quite as detailed. All right. Now, I'm also choosing to represent these in a few different ways. So we can see that we've got the label tool without any markers, and that's because it's generally representing this entire slab. I've got a label tool here, and I'm using a big dot because what I'm trying to explain is that there's a set down slab underneath this wall that the wall sits on, and so I need to communicate that. So when I go up to this level, I'll repeat this process again. So we'll put it over here. I need to hover for a second because I need to make sure I'm on the right thing. So when I hover, we can see that I'm on the wall at the moment. That's not going to work. So I need to hold or click tab, and we can see that's now adjusted. So I'm showing my slab, and then I can draw, and therefore I'm representing. So we can see that this one was 25730, 25680. So that's telling me, let me just do that again, tab, go into the settings, we can see that that's minus 50 millimeters. Now, of course, I could say minus 50 millimeters, but that's not a really exacting way of working because I'm not trying to communicate what the height is to this story. I'm trying to communicate to the builder what the height is for the entire project. And so we'll do the same thing out here and the same thing here. So we can see that all of these slabs are at different heights. So we've got, in this case, the main floor structure, and then we've got wet areas and the slab edge set down 50 millimeters, and then we've got an exterior slab that's set down 100 millimeters. So it's a constant stepping. We may also have elements like this where there's a void that's cut, and in this case it's for the stair, and then I've got another few little voids. There's a void here, and then there's a void here. Now we can do this in a couple of different ways. So ArchiCAD has an opening tool. So we can use the opening tool in order to be able to do these. We can also just cut it out of the slab. And personally, I just prefer the cutting out of the slab option. Now that means we may also want to use some lines to represent this in a little bit more detail. And so I might use a solid line, might use a fairly thin pen. In this case, I'm going to put it on the correct layer. And so I'll go to overlay Setout. And I'll draw a X across through this area because that's a void. Same with this one. Now, this I would classify this more as a riser than a general void. Now this stair area, more of a general void. So in this case, I'll use a different method. I'll add a fill. In this case, I'll add a fill, which I've called void, and we'll change that to, again, the same one. Overlay Setout. And I'll change this to polygonal method. And I'll just trace around these walls. Hold Shift in this case to make it nice and straight. Now I don't need to see the area calculation. That was just a setting that I had turned on, so I can just turn that off. That'll be fine. I also don't need to have an outline at the moment. I can have an outline, but that may end up doubling up. So I'm going to try to avoid that if possible. Now the grid lines are a little bit, or they're not confusing, but that makes it a little bit hard to read because the grid lines are running across the slabs. In this case, the grid lines are really essential because we're going to use those in order to be able to help dimension. And so we now need to add dimensions to these as well. So I'll pick up the settings of this just so I don't have to do it again. We'll go up to the lower ground floor. And so in this case, I'm going to go from left to right. I'm going to go along the outer edge, the top edge, and I'm going to try to pick up all of the points where my slab goes. Now, this wall could be done in a couple of different ways. I could have a slab that sits underneath this wall. So in this case, I'll assume that that's what I'm doing. And I just want to pick up all of the edges of the slab. Now, if I'm doing this really well, I don't want to cheat or select the wrong thing. So again, I'll press Tab. And so I'm actually selecting the slab rather than selecting the wall. And that means if anything changes with either the wall or the slab, that's going to automate that process for me. So that's a really good way of working. Now, this is a fairly complicated slab, so I am picking up a lot of points. So I just need to be mindful of how many different points that I am picking up. And where possible, I want to make sure that I'm ultimately referencing to a grid. So I can keep going the whole way along, and it's good to keep going the whole way along, as in doing it all in one go. And I'm not trying to do the walls as well, because we will be picking up the walls later. So I'm just trying to focus on the slab junctions. So we can see it changes height here. And we have two more, because here we have a step in the slab. And then we have the outside edge of the slab. Too far. And then we have the edge of the beam. And in this case, even though it's a beam in ArchiCAD, it's poured as a slab on site. So we're going to include that. I'm going to bring this out just because if it's too close, it's sometimes hard to place it. And then I'll bring it back so it's in line. And I can bring it down as much as I need so there's enough of a gap. Here we see that because of the small size, this is doubling up. So I'll just bring that down a little bit further so it's not crowding the drawing. And now what I do, if I'm being very detailed, and sometimes something like this would be very hard to read, what I could also do is to basically annotate the dimensions. Now I can do this included with the dimension tool, or I can just do this as text. What I'm trying to communicate here to the reader, to the builder, is this dimension string is about the slabs, and then I'll do another dimension string that's setting out the walls. Now I'll go back and check, make sure that I did this well, make sure that my dimension line does relate to the grids. Now it doesn't need to relate to all the grids, but it needs to relate to at least enough of the grids that I'm not going to get confused. So in this case, it's probably a good idea if I also add this particular dimension string to this particular grid. Now I can do that based on the grid tool, or I can do that based on something in the model where they align, such as the corner of this slab there, which would probably be better. But that's effectively now giving the builder on site multiple different reference points so they don't have to measure back 3 grids to make that work. Now the one extra thing I just want to explain that makes this work pretty well is that I need to have the reference for the boundary line and the reference for the grids and the reference for the dimensions for the grids on every story. So rather than copying these from story to story, in this case what we can see is that I've linked this as a hot linked module. And that means that I can't accidentally edit it in this file. It's going to be locked, and I'm not needing to copy it multiple times. It's actually just referenced. It's brought in from another source. Originally it was in this file. Effectively I created an MOD file, which is a module file, but that just means that I have some assurance that I'm not going to be accidentally editing the file, and it gives me more quality assurance that I'm doing it correctly, and particularly as time goes on and maybe other people in my office are working on this same file, and just to make sure nothing becomes inconsistent. And of course, once those grids are drawn and once the surveyor puts those grids on site, I can't move those grids. Now the walls might change, but I can't change the grids. So it's really important that they stay the same and that they're accurate with their representation.